The average human body contains approximately 5 liters of blood. Inside a burning tank, that blood begins to boil at around 100 degrees Celsius. The interior of a Sherman tank struck by a German 75mm round could reach 800 degrees within 90 seconds. Most crews had less than 15 seconds to escape before the ammunition began cooking off. Those who could not open their hatches did not die from the fire itself. They died from the pressure. The superheated air expanded so rapidly inside the sealed compartment that lungs ruptured before the flames ever touched skin. Pathologists examining recovered remains often found that the cause of death was not burning, but explosive decompression of the chest cavity. The fire came after. It consumed what the pressure had already killed. Between 1942 and 1945, an estimated 18,000 American tankers were killed in action. The official statistics do not separate those who died on impact from those who died trying to escape. There was no practical way to categorize the difference. What remained inside a destroyed tank rarely permitted that level of forensic distinction. Graves registration units developed their own informal terminology for what they recovered. The word most commonly used in their private reports was simply fused. Other terms existed, but they were never written down. They passed between the men who did this work in quiet conversations, language invented to describe what no existing vocabulary could accommodate. This is not a story about tank battles or armored tactics. This is about the space between the moment of penetration and the moment of death, measured in seconds that lasted longer than hours, inside steel boxes that were never designed to let anyone out quickly. The development of the tank in the First World War addressed a simple problem: how to move men across a bullet-swept landscape without exposing them to direct fire. The solution was to enclose them in armor. For 20 years after that war, military engineers focused on making that armor thicker, the guns larger, the engines more powerful. Remarkably little attention was paid to what happened when the armor failed. The assumption, rarely articulated but always present, was that armor either worked or it did not. The middle ground, where armor failed partially and men died slowly, was not a design consideration. By the time the Sherman entered mass production in 1942, American armored doctrine had settled on a philosophy of mobility over protection. The thinking was straightforward. A lighter tank could be produced faster, shipped easier, and maneuvered more effectively than a heavily armored fortress on tracks. If it was hit, the crew would bail out and fight another day in a replacement vehicle. Industrial capacity would absorb the losses. The mathematics made sense on paper. A Sherman weighed 33 tons. A German Tiger weighed 57. America could build 5 Shermans in the time it took Germany to build 1 Tiger. Quantity had a quality all its own. What this doctrine failed to account for was the simple mechanical reality of escape. A Sherman had 2 primary hatches, one in the turret for the commander and gunner, one in the hull for the driver and assistant driver. The loader had no dedicated exit and was expected to follow the gunner out through the turret. Under ideal conditions, a trained crew could evacuate in under 8 seconds. Ideal conditions meant the tank was upright, not burning, not flooded, not wedged against terrain, and the hatches were not jammed by the impact that had just penetrated the armor. Ideal conditions almost never existed. Training for emergency evacuation was conducted on stationary tanks in controlled environments. Men practiced the sequence until it became automatic. Release the latch, push upward, pull yourself through, roll off the deck. What training could not simulate was the disorientation of an actual hit. The concussion alone could render a man unconscious for several seconds. The noise temporarily destroyed hearing. The smoke blinded, and the hatches, which opened smoothly in training, became impossible obstacles when bent by a fraction of an inch. The German 75mm PaK-40 anti-tank gun could penetrate a Sherman's frontal armor at ranges exceeding 1,000 meters. The round itself was designed to maximize after-armor effect, meaning it did not simply punch a clean hole through the steel. Upon penetration, the shell fragmented into hundreds of superheated metal shards called spall, turning the interior of the tank into a blender of molten steel traveling at several thousand meters per second. In many cases, the driver and assistant driver were killed instantly, but not always. Sometimes the round entered through the turret ring or the side armor, leaving the hull crew alive but trapped behind hatches that had been welded shut by the heat and pressure of the impact. Technical Sergeant Howard Peterson, who served with the 3rd Armored Division in France, later described what he witnessed after a Sherman in his platoon was struck near Mortagne in August 1944. The round had hit the turret, killing the commander and gunner immediately. The driver and assistant driver were still alive. Peterson could see them through the vision slits, their hands pressed against the inside of the hatches, which had been bent inward by the concussion. The bow gunner's hatch was jammed at a 40-degree angle, open just enough to create a chimney effect when the ammunition fire started. Peterson said the screaming lasted approximately 20 seconds. He remembered counting. He said that counting was the only way to endure it, to reduce it to a number rather than a sound. American tankers began developing their own terminology for the Sherman almost immediately after arriving in North Africa in late 1942. The most common nickname was Ronson, after the cigarette lighter brand whose advertising slogan was "Lights first time, every time." The British, who had already been fighting German armor for 2 years, called it the Tommy Cooker. Both names referred to the same phenomenon. The Sherman's gasoline engine and ammunition storage made it extraordinarily prone to catastrophic fire upon penetration. Later models incorporated wet ammunition storage surrounding the shells with water jackets to reduce the likelihood of cooking off. This modification reduced fire rates from roughly 60% to around 15%, but the earlier models continued to serve throughout the war. There were simply too many of them to replace. German tank crews faced a different but equally terrifying calculus. The Panther and Tiger tanks offered superior armor and firepower, but their mechanical complexity created its own category of death. The Panther's interleaved road wheel suspension, designed to distribute weight more evenly across soft terrain, had a fatal flaw in winter conditions. Mud would freeze between the wheels overnight, immobilizing the tank until crews could chip it free with hand tools. On the Eastern Front, this process sometimes took hours. Soviet infantry quickly learned to time their attacks for early morning, when German armor was still frozen in place. Crews who could not free their tanks in time faced a choice: abandon their vehicle and freeze in the open, or remain inside and hope the ice melted before the Soviet assault arrived. Those who remained inside discovered that a stationary tank is simply a bunker with thinner walls. Soviet anti-tank rifles, too weak to penetrate German armor under normal circumstances, could punch through at point-blank range. Soviet doctrine emphasized swarming tactics, and infantry would approach immobilized tanks from blind spots, placing charges directly against the hull. The explosion rarely penetrated the armor. Instead, it created spall on the interior surface, filling the compartment with metal fragments. Crews died not from the enemy's weapon, but from their own tank's protection turning against them. Escape from a Panther was even more difficult than from a Sherman. The German design philosophy prioritized frontal protection at the expense of ergonomics. The driver's hatch was located in the glacis plate, directly beneath the gun mantelet. To exit, the driver had to wait for the turret to rotate to a specific position, clearing the hatch's arc of movement. In combat, with the turret traversing to track targets, this window might never open. Drivers learned to time their escape attempts between shots, counting the seconds of the reload cycle. Many mistimed it. The turret weighed several tons and moved with hydraulic force. The results were not survivable. Soviet tank crews confronted a mechanical environment that seemed designed by someone who had never considered the possibility of survival. The T-34, widely regarded as one of the best tank designs of the war, was also one of the most difficult to escape. The driver's hatch was located directly in front of the turret, meaning it could not open if the turret was traversed even slightly off-center. The hull machine gunner had no hatch at all in early models, and was expected to exit through the driver's position after the driver had already left. In a burning tank, with seconds to live, this sequence rarely completed. Later models added a floor escape hatch, but this required the crew to drop directly beneath the tank's belly, into whatever terrain it was currently sitting on. On soft ground, this meant dropping into mud, while 30 tons of burning steel settled above. On hard ground, it meant broken ankles and legs, followed by immobility beneath a vehicle that was about to explode. Soviet tank crews averaged fewer combat missions before death or serious injury than any other branch of the Red Army. The statistics were so grim that tankers were given special rations, including a daily allocation of vodka that was not officially extended to regular infantry. Western observers sometimes interpreted this as evidence of Soviet callousness toward human life. It was more accurately understood as an acknowledgement of what those men were being asked to endure. The vodka was not a reward. It was an apology, offered in advance for what would come. The psychological texture of these deaths cannot be reconstructed from official records, but fragments survive in letters, memoirs, and interviews recorded decades later. What emerges is not a single narrative of horror, but a catalog of small, precise details that collectively describe an experience beyond ordinary fear. The weight of a hatch, the temperature of metal when it has been absorbing engine heat for hours, the particular sound of the turret motor when it begins to traverse overhead, the smell of hydraulic fluid mixing with diesel, which meant fire was coming, the feeling of another man's hands grabbing at your legs as you tried to climb upward through the turret ring, and the knowledge that only one of you would fit through at a time. The choice that was not a choice, because your body was already moving before your mind could intervene. American, German, British, and Soviet crews all reported the same phenomenon. In the moments after their tank was hit, time seemed to simultaneously stop and accelerate. Seconds stretched into what felt like minutes, while their bodies moved with agonizing slowness through the smoke and chaos. Those who escaped often described a strange guilt at having been closer to the hatch, or having been smaller, or having simply been luckier. Those who did not escape left behind only silence and the testimony of those who witnessed their last moments from outside. After the war, the victorious nations conducted extensive studies of tank survivability, incorporating lessons learned into the next generation of armored vehicles. Hatches became larger and easier to operate. Ammunition was moved to protected compartments with blowout panels designed to direct explosions away from the crew. Automatic fire suppression systems were installed, capable of extinguishing flames within milliseconds of detection. Each improvement was a monument to someone who had died because the improvement did not exist yet. Each design change was a lesson written in fire and paid for in human life. The men who crewed those earlier tanks understood that they were, in a sense, experimental data. They were testing theories of armored warfare with their bodies, inside machines that had been designed for mobility and firepower, but not for the preservation of human life. They climbed into their Shermans and Panthers and T-34s, knowing the statistics, knowing the nicknames, knowing what had happened to the crews before them. They did it anyway, because the war required it, and because someone had to sit in the driver's seat, and because the hatch always seemed like it would open when the time came. The men who discovered otherwise left no testimony. Their final moments existed only in the imagination of those who found them afterward, or who heard the sounds from outside, or who spent the rest of their lives not thinking about what they had not been able to prevent. No memorial lists their names separately from the others who died in armored combat. There is no category for them in the official histories. They are simply counted among the losses, undifferentiated, as if the manner of their dying was a detail too small to record. But the men who survived knew the difference. They knew it every time they climbed into a tank for the rest of the war, and every time they woke from dreams they could not describe to anyone who had not been inside a steel box, waiting for a hatch that would not open.